Brady, a novella by D.W. Hitz. Chapter 1. The sun cast an orange light on the front door as Carl Chambers grabbed the knob. His shoulder ached as he turned his wrist, and a sigh escaped his lips. He spread the door wide into an empty home. It wasn't empty of furniture. It was empty of life, and the lack of companionship weighed on his chest. The absence of claws clacking against the wood floor, the quiet. Without panting, without a shallow whine from Brady being excited he was home. It was empty of the love that he felt at every re-entry. His breath trembled as he shut the door. He took a seat on the bench that separated the entry from the living room and removed his boots. He checked their soles and found that they had much less dirt clumped between the treads than he had expected. He had already wiped away the blood. He set them aside. The silence permeated his being. The corners of his eyes burned. Brady was gone, the shot still ringing in his ears. He could still feel the last touch, the last time his fingers would stroke the thick black fur. His stomach was sour. His gaze passed over a pair of small purple hiking boots by the wall, and he thought about how Amanda's face would look when she came to visit in the next days. The tears, the hugs of grief. He would have to tell her about it, and it would ruin at least the first day of her visit. Maybe all of it. Carl stood and walked across the living room, through the kitchen, and paused in the laundry room long enough to strip his clothes away and drop them into the washer. He wanted the dirt, the essence of what he had done, all of it, washed away as soon as possible. He stood naked and poured in detergent, then entered his room. The shower rinsed away his sweat and soothed his muscles. His shoulders still hurt from digging the grave, and he imagined they would continue for days, if not weeks. He had to make the hole deep. This was the country, and if he didn't dig deep, a bear or fox or even a mountain lion might dig up the body and eat it. The smell would call them, even through several feet of dirt. Brady deserved better than that, and Carl felt that he deserved whatever pain he had been forced to go through for doing the job. Whether or not the event was Carl's fault was debatable, but he blamed himself. He knew Brady was aggressive when he got off the property. He knew if Brady got out of the house without being on his leash, the dog would run and run, no matter who tried to call him back. He blamed it on the hound and his ancestry. The lab made him big. The hound made him run and chase. He had known that at some point Brady was going to get loose and cause a problem. He'd been told by the neighbors, told by his friends, told by anyone who had met the dog that it was a problem waiting to happen. One day, he's gonna bite a kid, and you'll get sued, his brother had told him. At least, it wasn't a kid, Carl thought. Carl pictured the large black dog, his giant brown eyes shining with love. He remembered the smell of gun smoke and aspirated blood. He didn't want to do it, but after Brady bit that old woman, either he or animal control would have to do it, and Brady was his dog, his responsibility. So he did what he had to do, and he'd hate himself every day for the rest of his life for having to do it. Carl turned off the water and dried himself. He went into the kitchen, near dark from the onset of night, and took a can of beer from the fridge. There were 5 in there, and Carl figured they'd all be gone by the time he hit the sheets that night. He sat in his gray recliner and felt around on the end table for the remote. He clicked the television on and reclined. He popped open the can and flipped through the menu on Hulu. There were 1,000 things to watch, and he cared about none of them. Each thumbnail caused a feeling of exhaustion. The thought of watching any of them made him shrink at the idea of having to pay attention to them. His mind wasn't ready for that. No, he needed something thoughtless. Something he had seen 1,000 times and required no active thought, something that he could turn on and ignore. Carl guzzled his beer for a solid 30 seconds and flipped the Roku over to Vudu. He scanned the movies in the library and chose Airplane, a mindless gap filler, something that would occupy the quiet in his home long enough for him to swallow a few beers and hopefully prepare him to pass out. He wanted to pass out. He dared not go to bed, though, and he'd spend the next 2 hours rolling back and forth, unable to sleep, picturing Brady's grave being filled in with clumps of dirt and clay, shovelful by shovelful. He guzzled again. The movie started. There was only darkness when it happened, only quiet. The movie had finished. Carl's eyes were shut, his mind in some other place, a realm of sleep not far from the surface, but enough for him to have forgotten the truth of the real world. Beer cans had gathered on the end table. Carl's recliner was up, and the light blanket had found its way to his legs at some point. That was when something made itself known. Brang, brang, brang. Rising twang shouted through the room from behind Carl. They rang like a rising pitch on a discordant acoustic guitar. But it was too loud for a guitar, and Carl had no guitar, and even if he did, there was no one else in the house to play it. Carl shot up in his seat, eyes wide. Chills ran through him. He spun, staring into the kitchen, the dining room. What the hell? He saw little. The television was a wall of black, and the dim glow it emitted merely lit the surrounding few feet. And those few feet weren't where the noise had come from. It had come from the dining room. Carl lowered the recliner and stood. He felt a chill. He must have left the window open, and the night's breeze was creeping through the house. He was sure that was it. That was the cause of the noise. Of course, the change in temperature and the house settling. He wasn't convinced. The coolness in his veins spread. He squinted through the open concept space into the dining room. There was nothing in there that could have made the sound. A table, some chairs, the antique china cabinet, all of which he had inherited from his mother with the house. Is someone there? There was no answer. And why would there be? Carl fought back his shivers, convincing himself that he was being ridiculous. There had been no noise. He had been sleeping, and he had a dream of someone twanging an old guitar. That was all. Then he woke up, depressed about Brady, and he had imagined something. That type of thing was supposed to happen to people that were sad, wasn't it? Carl rubbed his arms, shook his head. He picked up the remote and clicked the television off. It was time for bed. He crossed the living room to close the dining room windows. His gaze went to a spot in front of the china cabinet where Brady often laid. In the darkness, he saw him. The shadowy silhouette of a large black dog was there, and Carl gasped. He stopped and gulped. He took a step closer. It was gone. Nothing. A trick of light. It was too late. He was drunk. He felt guilty. His mind was playing tricks on him. He told himself all those things and brushed away the pins and needles that were tickling his skin. Carl walked to the sliding door and locked it. He pictured Brady standing outside, staring up at him, waiting to come in. Carl's eyes burned. He turned and went to bed. When morning came and the rays of daylight broke through the bedroom curtains, Carl was relieved. His head ached. His entire body was sore, and he was drop-dead tired, but it was a new day. A day without Brady, which he hated, but an end to a sleepless, unrestful state. He rolled to the edge of the bed and hung his feet down to the floor. Squeaks of his mattress reminded him of something that he'd heard overnight, a high-pitched sound from the living room area and clunks and cracks of the house settling. The house did that during the spring and fall, days where the temperatures swung greatly between hot and cold. But last night there were too many noises, and it couldn't have been as loud and as long as it seemed. It must have been a dream, one of those things the mind amplifies inside of itself, a recurring echo as the subconscious tries to figure out a mystery. Carl pushed to his feet and dragged himself to the bathroom. As he stood in front of the toilet, aiming into the bowl, Carl felt as though something were watching him. He glanced around the room, half expecting to see Brady in the doorway, waiting to be served his breakfast. Nothing. He shook his head and drained his bladder. He wondered if the entire day would be like this, constant remembrances of his beloved pet, of his betrayal of his friend. In the kitchen, Carl opened the refrigerator door. He expected to hear the clack of claws race across the house. It didn't happen. He cooked sausage and eggs and made a cup of coffee. It was only when he sat at the counter to eat that Carl's gaze passed into the dining room and over to the china cabinet. What the fuck? He dropped his food onto the counter and stared. The clank of his ceramic plate against the brown laminate surface went unnoticed. Across the dining room were scattered each and every dish that had been in the cabinet when Carl went to sleep. The china, like the cabinet itself, was all inherited from his mother because he had no sister to take them, and his brother didn't care. Mom had left it with him, along with the house, hoping that he might give it to Amanda one day. The stuff was plain and inelegant compared to the high-priced tableware of today, and he doubted it was the type that a young woman would want by the time she was old enough to receive it. But he also would have doubted that he would have woken up to see this. Bowls, plates, and teacups covered the table, chairs, and floor. Blue on white swirls and roses made a collage of round shapes across the dining room. Few things appeared broken, but each dish and cup was stacked haphazardly on top of one another, off-kilter and on edge, as if the slightest nudge might send the entirety down to the floor in a crash. "What the fuck?" Carl repeated. He walked slowly around the counter. What could have done this? It couldn't have been an earthquake. That may have knocked the cabinet over, but not lifted the contents out and dropped them onto the table. Did someone break in during the night? It wasn't a concern that ever bothered him before. Brady was such a good guardian. If anyone had come in, they would have wished they hadn't. But Brady wasn't there last night. Carl glanced at the television. Still there. It wasn't a burglary. He took a walk around the house, checking doors and windows, all locked, just as he had left them. The only thing out of place was the dining room. He walked around the outside of the dining table, stepping where he could without destroying plates, saucers, and cups. The spot on the floor where Brady would have lain was strangely clear of debris. Carl kneeled and touched the spot. It was warmer than he had expected, and a cold chill crossed the back of his neck. He shivered and looked up at the cabinet. The old oak was carved in a style that he had been told was French country. It was generally plain on the top half, but the bottom had ornate flourishes and details that always struck him as odd. Symbols were carved into the wood in a way that made them look like decoration, but stood out to Carl as being out of place, as intentional but veiled. As his gaze passed the windowless lower half, something inside caught his eye. There was a dark thing, nearly black, in the middle of the cabinet. It wasn't on the shelf, though. It looked like it was stuck to the ceiling, above the molding and recesses upward, where no one would possibly see without getting down low, and probably not without emptying the cabinet first. Carl reached for it. The air within the cabinet was frigid. It was like the inside of a freezer on a hot day. It made the hairs on his arms stand up and stiffen. In the hard-to-see crevice, Carl felt something smooth, like a velvety cloth. It was wrapped around a hard, circular object no wider than Carl's hand. He gripped it with his thumb and pinky and pulled. The thing seemed to peel away like a strip of Velcro. What is this? He scooted back from the mess and stared at the thing in his hand. The velvety cloth was a bag with a folded end. He found the opening and tipped it upside down, letting the contents fall into his free hand. The object that fell was cool and gray, round and smooth like a stone disc. Carl's hand felt the coolness creep over his skin and into his fingers. He flipped the disc and examined the other side. This side wasn't smooth and blank. It was intricately carved. Interconnected circles and strange pictures decorated the disc. They looked hieroglyphic, but not Egyptian. Brown stains overlapped the carvings, and a deep sense of dread sank into Carl as he traced them with his finger. Numbness moved down Carl's digits and into his palm. He flipped the disc over and moved it from hand to hand, trying to see what was causing the sensation. He saw nothing, but the feeling drifted from hand to hand, following the stone circle, until both hands felt numb from palms to fingertips. Shit. Carl dropped it to the floor. It wobbled and clunked on the wood. He shuffled backward, staring the circle down as he moved. He stared at his hands, hoping the numbness would abate, but something called his eyes back to the disc. Something called him to move forward, closer to the strange thing. Carl couldn't feel his fingers, but still, he reached to touch it. Something told him to keep going, that the strange feeling would pass. He just had to pick the stone circle up, and everything would be all right. He placed his hand over it, again, with his thumb and pinky on its edge. He lifted it and held it in front of his face. He forced himself to look away and then back, because what he saw didn't make any sense. It wasn't right, but it held wonder. The carving in the stone, they were moving. The strange words, the drawings, they were rotating, sliding, shifting over and under each other. It was weird, a sight such as he had never seen before. Wonder turned to worry turned to fear. Carl attempted to put the disc back down, but when he tried to let go, his fingers wouldn't release it. Instead, the cold numbness moved up his arms. It waved over his chest. The freezing sensation flowed down his legs. Carl tried to scream. His mouth refused to move. As the numbness rose up his neck, a warm wetness rolled down. It came from above his forehead, over his face like a baptism. But it wasn't warm water. What he saw come over his eyes like a sheet was blood.